Apparently, they were testing these models in some sort of environment. They escaped from this test environment. Then they ended up hacking into another company.
It was essentially trying to cheat on the test. It was trying to go get the answers rather than doing it itself.
Hello and welcome to Fortune AI Weekly. I'm Jeremy Kahn, Fortune's AI editor.
And I'm Nolan, Fortune's AI reporter.
Fortune AI Weekly is a vodcast where we discuss all the AI news from the past week that business leaders need to know. Fortune AI Weekly is brought to you by ServiceNow. ServiceNow's AI specialists do the work, start to finish, so people can do the parts of the job they're best at. To learn more, visit servicenow.com. So B, we had huge news this week. There was this bizarre and scary incident in which OpenAI basically disclosed that some of its AI models that it was testing internally, including one model that was not yet released, and GPT 5.6 Sol, which is a model, the latest model they have released. Apparently, they were testing these models in some sort of environment. They escaped from this test environment. Then they ended up hacking into another company. Can you talk a little bit more about what happened here?
Yeah, I mean, they were being tested on their cyber capabilities, and some of their safeguards had been removed. But yeah, essentially, they managed to sort of hack their way out of OpenAI's secure Sandbox and hack into this other company, Hugging Face.
And Hugging Face is this company that is it's another AI company. It's a kind of platform that hosts a lot of open source models, but also hosts benchmarks. So these tests that AI companies use to assess how good their models are at certain skills. The tests are housed with Hugging Face, and those tests tend to have some sort of answers housed with them. Is that right?
Yeah, it was essentially trying to cheat on the test. It was trying to go get the answers rather than doing it itself. So I guess one thing to point out is like, it wasn't sort of pursuing its own goals. Like, this isn't like an AI that's decided it's going to go do something and made up its own motivations. It was technically doing what it was told to do. It was just doing it in a way that OpenAI did not really expect.
Right. I mean, this is what AI researchers like to call reward hacking, where you give the model some kind of goal, but it decides that there's some shortcut to achieving that goal and pursues that shortcut. And the shortcut is not something that a user would have wanted the model to do. It's not what the model, the people building the model intended it to do. Do we know how they managed to do this, B?
Yeah, they found a security flaw in OpenAI's own sandbox and then essentially hacked across the rest of OpenAI's systems to find a computer that was connected to the internet. It was quite an impressive feat.
And did OpenAI realize that this was happening in real time?
From what we can tell, maybe not. Hugging Face didn't know for a while that who was behind the attack. So it's a little unclear. But the other interesting thing was that Hugging Face said they tried to use an American model, we don't know which one, to try and stop the attack, but actually got hit with these safeguards that are on both Fable and 5.6 and some of the other advanced models to stop them being used for cyber attacks, but also stop them being used for cyber defense. They had to turn to a Chinese model, an open source model, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, I think that raised a lot of eyebrows out there and got the attention of everybody in the sort of cybersecurity community. Hugging Face's CEO, Clem DeLange, said they had tried to use this American model and it didn't work because of these guardrails. And as you noted, also the models that engaged in the attack had their guardrails turned off because they were in this testing environment. But these guardrails are supposed to be fairly strict and prevent people from using them for cyber attacks. But a lot of people are complaining that the guardrails are too strict, right, B?
Yeah, there's been some complaints about that. I don't know, there was a few interesting things with this whole attack. One of the things that was interesting to me was like some of the reactions. Did you see the people everyone thought was fake?
Yeah, I know, that's fascinating. So a number of people were saying, this is some kind of publicity stunt. This can't be real. It's all part of marketing. Some people kind of raised eyebrows, I think, at the OpenAI blog post in which they revealed this incident, because actually at the very end of that blog post, there's kind of a call to action to become part of our trusted network of partners who gets to use the full cyber capabilities of GPT 5.6. And I think some people were like, this is all some kind of marketing ploy, but there's no evidence of that, right?
No, there's no evidence of that. But I thought it was interesting because I had like engineers reaching out to me, like quite technical people being like, are they just trying to get their mythos moment, as in their moment where they're like, oh, we have a really powerful model and it's doing these really scary things. There is no evidence that it's fake at all. I mean, Hugging Face confirmed it and they both released technical reports. But I did think the reaction was interesting and maybe speaks to perhaps like a bit of a lack of trust in these labs. They've been saying for a while they're building these really powerful models and they have these quite sometimes doomsday situations they describe. So I can see how people got there, but it was definitely an interesting reaction.
Either way, like if the incident is real, it's a huge wake up call, and should be setting off 5-alarm fires among policymakers to try to take some serious action. But even if it's some kind of marketing ploy, that's a huge problem too. And a number of AI policy people I spoke to said it's just why it shows why the AI labs should really be compelled to have some kind of independent auditing of what they're doing, and maybe to turn over logs when these kinds of incidents occur, so that somebody can actually check that did this happen in the way that the AI labs say it did? Did they take the precautions that they say they took? All of that kind of stuff. Right now, we just have to take the AI companies' words for it, don't we?
Yeah, we do. And I don't know. I know you've been looking into the regulatory side of this and whether this is going to spark some more regulation. Obviously, it was the Mythos stuff that kind of prompted the kind of quasi regulation we have at the moment. So this is a huge incident. Like it's made like national general news as well. Do you think this is going to like be a bit of a wake up call for regulators, or have you not seen much?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Emily Forlini, one of our other AI reporters, and I did some reporting on this week, and everybody we talked to in the AI policy community was saying this ought to be a wake up call. This seems like it ought to reinforce policymakers' concerns, which, as you mentioned, were already kind of have been building really since Anthropic released Mythos. It really seems to have turned around a lot of people in the US government who were initially kind of opposed to AI regulation, or at least were sort of unconcerned about the model capabilities. And suddenly they become very concerned. And we know that people in the national security establishment in the US are extremely concerned about these cyber capabilities and what it might enable an attacker to do, or an adversary government to do. And they're racing to kind of both secure their own systems, but also really to try to limit how the kind of proliferation of these capabilities, how many people are going to have access to these models with these advanced capabilities. So that's really kind of in the policymaking kind of zeitgeist right now. And there's a number of people in Congress starting to make noise about we need to do something. But so far, we have not actually seen any concrete reaction from the administration to this incident. And I don't know, it's possible that this won't be the thing that, people talk about a 3 Mile Island incident for AI, drawing comparisons to what happened with nuclear power in the US, and how that incident really set off much more stringent nuclear regulation. But I don't know. I'm not quite sure this is going to get there. I think fewer people know what Hugging Face is. A lot of people, because Hugging Face wasn't really damaged by this attack, maybe people will kind of shrug it off. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. I think if you take a step back a couple of years and said the words, an AI company hacked another company and didn't even notice that it was happening, that would have been a pretty crazy thing to say. And also, if this was like a Chinese model that did this, I think that would have been a different conversation. Like, I'm not sure there would have been as much trust that was sort of like an accident. And I don't know. If this has happened once, I think it possibly could happen again. I think it's worth saying that this isn't the first time a model has escaped its sandbox in these testing environments. Anthropic found a similar thing with Mythos. They asked it to do it. Like they'd said, please try and escape your sandbox, but it did. And then the engineer was eating a sandwich in the park or something, and Mythos emailed it and was like, hey, I'm out. So like this has happened. This is I don't think this is going to be the last time things like this happen. So I would think that it would prompt people to start thinking a bit more seriously about regulation. But
absolutely. I think, this is a pretty scary incident. And a lot of the people I talked to, AI safety researchers and policy people this past week were saying, this was in some ways a perfect warning shot because, again, nobody was really hurt. But you could imagine, if this had been a bank or a hospital, what the reaction would be then. And then you might have people really harmed by this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the administration is unwilling to regulate AI generally, especially after the export controls they put on Mythos and how that's kind of affected the rest of the world's view of them. There was an interesting story, I think it was in Reuters, about the White House briefing, Marco Rubio briefing diplomats to say, sort of play down this idea that America has a kill switch on its AI. And you can see why they want to do this, right? Like it's very hard to tell your technology internationally if there's a chance that you could just pull the plug on the American side.
Yeah, I think it's pretty fascinating.
In other administration news, we saw they came out against Kimi K3, which we were talking about last week, and accused the Moonshot of distilling Anthropic's models. What does that mean? What did you make of that?
Yeah, and again, Kimi K3 is this Chinese model that came out from Moonshot AI that, at least according to the benchmark results that that Moonshot itself released, was nearly as capable as Mythos or at least Fable rather from Anthropic, and GPT 5.6 from OpenAI, and even the independent benchmarking tests so far seem to show it's in about third place. So it's a pretty powerful model. The administration came out and was obviously quite concerned about this narrative that the U.S. is sort of falling behind, that the Chinese models are catching up. But they also came out and accused Moonshot of essentially stealing kind of Anthropic's IP, and in general, they've been accusing the Chinese AI labs of stealing the IP of the American AI vendors through this thing called distillation. And what is distillation, V?
Yeah, it's actually like a standard technique in AI. It's like when a smaller model is trained on a bigger model's outputs. So like you have a student and a teacher model, and it doesn't just learn like the right and wrong answers. It like actually taps into like how the other model thinks, quote unquote. But it's interesting because AI labs do this themselves. Like they'll use it internally to train smaller models on their bigger models and things like that. But the question is whether or not this constitutes a violation of like Anthropic's IP in this situation. And Anthropic's accused Chinese labs of doing this before, right?
Yeah, no, Anthropic came out and they had a report where they accused a bunch of Chinese labs of having done this using fake accounts to purposely send thousands of queries to these models, and then they harvest the answer. They take the query and they harvest the answer, and then they use that for training data. It's not clear that this is actually illegal in any way, but it does violate the terms of service of these AI models. So there is that.
Yeah, there was some concern about them getting advanced NVIDIA chips as well via Thailand.
Yeah, no, that's right. The U.S. says that they've discovered that Moonshot had access to these advanced chips through Thailand, as you say, and they've in the past have also said that they think the Chinese companies have access to NVIDIA chips that they're not supposed to have access to. There's been a lot of suspicion about this going back to even when DeepSeek came out with its R1 model back at the beginning of last year. There was DeepSeek had claimed to have used very little computing power to train that model, but a lot of people thought they might have not been completely truthful about that they actually might have used NVIDIA chips somewhere else. There's been some documentation of Chinese companies smuggling in NVIDIA GPUs into China itself, but also we know that there's been at least a few cases where the Chinese companies have been caught using data centers in other Asian nations, sometimes actually setting up front companies to hire that computing capacity in those countries.
Yeah, it's interesting. We should say maybe again that Anthropic has kind of lobbied for harsher controls on chips as well. But a couple of interesting things on this, maybe. Fable wasn't actually online for that long after the export controls were lifted before Kimi K3 shipped. I think it came back, maybe there was 10 days, 15 days in between. And there has been some researcher pushback that maybe that's not quite enough time to distill frontier level performance, and maybe the timeline doesn't support the claim as stated. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think you've seen different data on this, but it's absolutely true that Fable was not online for very long before Kimi came out. And so I think it's legitimate to say, was that actually enough time to get the kind of data you would need to distill a model? And it might be that it's not the case. But some researchers were showing where they tried to compare kind of answers from Kimi K3 to answers from the other AI models from different labs, and they used AI to kind of compare the outputs. And some of those analyses did seem to show that Kimi K3's outputs were most similar to the outputs from Fable 5.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if this maybe prompts more action from the Americans on Chinese models more generally. There's been a lot of murmurings that perhaps they're going to try and restrict these Chinese open source models, but not easy to do, to restrict open source models. What are some ways they're thinking about going about it, or even ways they could go about it?
Yeah, I think we don't know what they're going to do. There's talk about a ban. I guess one thing they could do is they could literally just ban American companies from using these models in any way. That's something they probably could do. That's pretty draconian. They also, though, there's been some suggestions that they could simply impose rules that would be very hard for the Chinese labs to meet. And those could include rules around AI safety testing and verification. And it just might be that those models couldn't ever meet those requirements. So it wouldn't be a hard ban, but it would essentially be a de facto ban. I think it really matters, though, like what the sort of point of the policy is. If the point of the policy is simply to hobble China and prevent Chinese models from being used, the US probably does have some power to do that. It has certainly a lot of leverage over what American companies do, but it may, if it really wants to go to the mat on this, could use kind of these extrajudicial powers that it's tried to use in other cases to prevent other people in other parts of the world from using these models as well. Like they might say, for instance, if foreign governments don't also ban the use of Chinese models, maybe it would threaten to cut those countries off from things like parts of the US banking system, which is this leverage that the US has. But again, that would be a pretty draconian step. And it would not, we should say that what it would not do, though, is really address this other concern about open source models more generally, which is that they're less safe than the proprietary models, that you can't really have robust guardrails in the models because somebody a bad actor who's at least bit technically sophisticated can simply strip out the guardrails. There doesn't seem to be like a technical fix for this. And I think that's more of an issue for open source. Generally, it doesn't matter if it's Chinese open source or American open source or European open source. That is just a problem with open source models.
Yeah, we should say that's probably why it's concerning that these open source models seem like they're chasing these frontier models like Fable and 5.6, because as we can see, 5.6 can do things like this. And if you have models that you can totally strip the guardrails off, how many more of these kind of attacks are we going to see?
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be a tough issue to resolve. So moving on to some other AI news this week, we had a bunch of new models come out from Google. Isn't that right?
Yeah, we had the release of these smaller and faster and more affordable Gemini models, but notably not GPT 3.5 Pro, which is what everyone was waiting for and expecting. And this has been delayed twice now.
Yeah, what's going on with Google?
I don't know. I mean, there was a bit of a pile on Twitter, including Meta's Alexander Wang had a bit of a swipe. You were looking at some of these reactions because someone posted from Google that it was in training, and then everyone was like, "Can't wait for it to be released," because obviously it's been held back twice. No one really knows what's going on with Google, but it does seem like they're perhaps struggling with the frontier model. Yeah,
I know. I felt bad for the folks over at Google DeepMind because they really did get dunked on X over the last few days. As you say, like there are people from other AI labs quite blatantly trolling them.
Yeah, I don't know. Perhaps a bit strong from Meta as well because they've also had their problems. But yeah, I mean, I've spoken to a couple of engineers at DeepMind at the moment. There's like maybe multiple reasons that this is happening. Some people say, it's kind of standard to have these bumps in the road, which is fair enough. But there's also a concern that maybe they weren't focused enough on the coding abilities of AI. There was a huge focus on chat for a while because they felt so behind ChatGPT, and they had their chatbot originally called Bard before it became Gemini, and that was a big focus for them. And then perhaps being a bit caught off guard with things like Claude Code and Codex, which are now Claude Code for Anthropic is now underpinning its Cowork, which is like a general use tool, and Codex for OpenAI is now underpinning this sort of super app that's also like a general use tool. So there's maybe a bit of a behind there as well.
Right. No, it's interesting. Although it doesn't seem to have hurt the profits for Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google DeepMind. We had earnings this week from Alphabet, and they were, pretty spectacular, right?
Yes, it was, I think, 112 billion net income. That was up almost 300% year on year. That was the first 12-figure quarterly profit in corporate history, apparently. But a lot of this came from unrealized and realized gains on investment, right?
No, that's right. So Google has a big investment, particularly in Anthropic. And it turns out that some large portion of this record profit was actually just kind of an accounting metric, which is the unrealized gain in the shares that Google owns in Anthropic.
Yes, and then they got a bump from SpaceX, which is obviously IPO'd recently. Google holds some of that stock as well. So it was very much looked good on paper. I think their stock slipped a bit after the earnings, despite the really good on paper results.
Yeah, and one thing I think the market noticed is while these these profit figures were incredible, as you say, that the first profit level ever recorded by a company at that level. There was something else that was sort of unprecedented here for Alphabet, which is that if you looked at their free cash flow, how much hard cash they were actually bringing in or sending out the door, they had negative free cash flow of close to $6 billion in the quarter. And this is the first time that Alphabet has had negative cash flow in the entire time it's been public. It went public in 2004. So, this is a sign that they're spending so much on building data center capacity, on trying to train these AI models, that it exceeds the total amount of revenue that they bring in from all of the advertising and all of the spend on Google Cloud. So I think that, was a worrying sign. I think investors picked up on that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've said before that the numbers around the data center build out and infrastructure look crazy on paper, but like this is quite a good example when you see how much it's actually affecting a company's bottom line, and you can see why that would worry investors.
Now we're going to move on to brain food, the last section of the podcast, where we talk about something a little bit different. And in this case, I wanted to talk to you about this slightly crazy Wall Street Journal story that appeared, where they talked about the fact that people are recording absolutely everything, taking audio recordings mostly of absolutely everything, meetings at work, but also kind of conversations in their personal lives. And they're doing this in order to then feed these conversations back through AI to kind of get coaching on what they could do better, to pull out insights. But it was slightly nuts to me. They said, particularly out in Silicon Valley, this has now become kind of the norm, and you have to just assume that any conversation you have with someone that you are being recorded.
I don't like that at all. I mean, do we need to have constant surveillance all the time? I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, I've seen it coming for a while, like these note takers. We probably are being a bit hypocritical because we're journalists, so we do actually record our conversations, with sources and things like that, but we tell them before we're recording them. Like, you can't, in a lot of countries and a lot of states, this breaks privacy laws if you record someone without telling them.
No, I mean, that was a point that the Wall Street Journal made. A lot of this trend is happening in California, and California is one of these states where you need someone's consent if you're going to record the conversation. But they said that people have been doing this, just essentially violating the law, and have been doing this anyway. A lot of venture capitalists, they said, have gotten so sick of going to, taking pitch meetings with startups, and the founders are, just recording the conversation the whole time, that they've actually taken to like having a disclaimer saying, you may not record this conversation without my permission, and actually pointing them to the law in California. But there are some people who are doing this very willingly and seem to want to do this, even in their own personal lives. That Wall Street Journal story also talked to a woman who said she records all of her dates.
Yeah, I've heard of someone who records their fights with their partner as well, just to take notes later, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. It's a tension at work as well. This has been a problem because these like AI note takers join meetings, and then sometimes they can stay in the meeting and see people will talk about someone that's left the meeting, and then it will all be on this note taker. So like there is I feel like it's been an ongoing problem. Notably, we had a newsroom meeting the other day, and our editor kicked all of the AI as transcription assistants out of it.
Yeah, no, I think it's controversial, as you say, even at work. But yeah, I would definitely not want my fights with my wife recorded for posterity.
Yeah, and also like, what are you recording them with? Like, where is that information going? Who owns it? Do you own it? I don't know. There's a couple of things that worry me about this trend.
Yeah, no, I think the assumption of privacy that people used to have in any kind of one-on-one conversation is just disappearing. And I can kind of understand why companies want to do this. There is a sense that they want to capture there's a lot of knowledge out there that's sort of not written down in any formal documents. And they feel that if they can record all these meetings, they can capture all of this tacit knowledge, and perhaps eventually train AI models to replicate that knowledge or replicate the outcomes that come from having that knowledge. I wrote about this a little bit when I wrote my book, but I do think like it's one thing to do it at work. It's quite another thing to do it in your personal life.
Yeah, and also don't you risk, like, if it gets to a point where everyone thinks they're being recorded all the time, don't you risk everyone being too cautious, especially at work and things like that? Like, you want people to be creative and feel safe enough to suggest ideas, or I don't know, like even in your personal life, if you feel like everything is going to be documented against you for the rest of your life, it's going to make everyone quite nervous.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's not only a death of privacy, but as you say, like the death of spontaneity. Anyway, I think that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for listening. listening. If you like what you heard, please like and subscribe.
Thanks for listening.